Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the online communist forum organised by the Communist Party of Great Britain. Jack Conrad from the Provisional Central Committee will be speaking first on the topic of the US elections and its outcomes, and then we'll open things for anyone who wishes to discuss or ask questions. So, over to you, Jack.
Many thanks, Billy. I suppose I'll begin with a confession. I thought, I don't know for how long, but for some time, that Trump had more than a evens chance of winning. And indeed, other than the initial Kamala Harris surge when she became the candidate, I have to say that remained my position. But I have to say that I thought it would be narrow. I thought that I would go to bed one night, wake up, and I thought that it would be more a question of indications that people had expected Trump to win. Instead, I went to bed going, yeah, I suspect that Trump will win, and got up, and Trump, well, I suppose he did that last time, didn't he? He announced that he was the victor, but the difference was this time is the polling showed that he was the victor. Okay, you didn't have Kamala Harris making a concession speech, but that was the news. Trump had won. Trump had won fairly and squarely and decisively. So, for example, this week's Weekly Worker, we already had an article by Michael Roberts, which was edited from being a maybe Trump will win article to a Trump has won article. And we did the same with other articles. So I have to admit that this edition of the Weekly Worker looks a lot smoother and far seeing than was actually the reality. But as I said, I thought that Trump would win, and here you are. And I don't think it's exaggerating to say that this is historic, of historic importance. Sometimes that word is overused, but I don't think so on this occasion. And it's got nothing to do with the margin of his victory. What is it in terms of electoral college? 226 to Kamala Harris, 301 to Donald Trump. He also won in terms of the popular vote. That's quite rare for Republicans. Last time I've got it down as 2004. Before that, 1988. So that is quite a remarkable achievement for Trump. We can also add in, of course, I don't know, have there been any other examples of a president? I think there has been, but a president being defeated and then coming back afterwards. I know there is an example, but even so, it's extremely rare. But the more important point is what it means politically. So it's not about statistics. It's not about looking, at the equivalent of, England test runs or how many wickets someone has got out and saying, well, this hasn't been done since whenever. It's the political impact that we're expecting Trump to have, both domestically in the United States, but also given that the United States is the global hegemon internationally. And I'm not going to go into everything because a lot of what I'm going to say is speculative, open-ended, I hope. But nonetheless, I think that I don't need to convince anybody of the momentum of this vote. In Socialist Worker, we've had, I think, over 2 weeks, an interview with August Nimps, a friend of ours in the United States who's authored some very good books on Lenin and Marx and Engels and their use of the electoral tactic. And he was actually saying that the crucial vote in the United States isn't going to be on November the 5th. It's not the presidential election, it's the Boeing vote, the Boeing strikers. I don't agree. That doesn't mean I would urge people to have voted Harris. And I go along with August when he says in the Socialist Worker interview that the left ought to be standing its own candidates. But this is a historically important election. It's not a Tweedledum, Tweedledee election. Now, that doesn't mean that I put myself in the camp, and I've argued this consistently, that Trump represents fascism, that this is goodbye to what passes for democracy in the United States. I don't take that position. I think that democracy in America, to use a phrase, would be a good idea. What you get under capitalism is democracy limited, by what the ruling class can get away with. The ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, is not a democratic class. The pressure for democracy comes from below. And there was pressure historically from below in the United States, hence the US Constitution. Nonetheless, I would make the argument that Trump isn't fascist, is not intending to introduce fascism. I don't see myself, the state, being unleashed to smash the trade unions, to ban opposition parties. I see an authoritarian trend, there's no doubt about that. And maybe, who knows, it's not impossible to imagine sections of the army or the army itself acting against Trump. After all, some of its leaders and ex-leaders have been using the F word about Trump. It's not just Kamala Harris and the Democrats. Okay, I was also looking, and this is again a sort of negative, at The Communist, the paper of the newly renamed Revolutionary Communist Party, aka Socialist Appeal, the Grantites. And they were saying, basically, this is, what's his name? God. Anyway, the name will come to me, Mr. Number One Man in the RCP. He was saying that the Trump vote was an anti-establishment vote. And his basic argument was that after the masses experience Trump, they will turn sharply to the left. This is a sort of version of what used to be called third period Stalinism. And it could be summed up by the Communist Party of Germany and their slogan, first Hitler and then us. I think that's profoundly mistaken. I don't think myself that the masses will experience Trump and go, well, what we want under these conditions is something sharply to the left. In my estimate, what we are seeing on a global level, with some exceptions, it's true, is a steady shift to the right. In other words, if we take what is called neoliberalism, it has failed. It hasn't produced wealth and prosperity for the masses in the advanced capitalist countries, let alone in the non-developed or the underdeveloped capitalist countries. Quite the opposite, in fact. What it's done is enriched to a huge, huge degree those who are already rich. And they, I suspect, will do very well under President Trump. And you can see that not only in terms of those who backed him, for example, Elon Musk, but you can actually see that in terms of the US stock exchange. So, for example, Standard & Poor's top 500 hit 6,000 and above for the first time. I don't know since when, but a long time. Telsa, you couldn't make it up, could you? Actually increased its value over to over $1 trillion for the first time in a long time. So the stock market has done well. People who are already billionaires have certainly added billions to their wealth, not least Elon Musk. Okay, so we now come to the question of why. Why did people vote? I mean, I had a comrade, and I readily understand. I was speaking to earlier this afternoon and said, why do the Americans vote for this madman? You know, why? Well, one, the choice was between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, who was basically the continuity candidate for Joe Biden. And what we've got, I've already referred to it, what we've got, I think, is a very good article by Michael Roberts, basically explaining it. And that is, if you're a billionaire in America, over the last 4 years, you've done well. But the average American hasn't done well, quite the opposite. What we're dealing with is stagnant living standards. We're no longer, of the generation that I was when I was young, that things will always get better, that our children will be much better off than us. They'll be better educated, more healthy, and more wealthy. That's no longer the case in a lot of advanced capitalist countries, not least the United States, where, for example, if we talk about life expectancy, I think, for white men, remarkably, is going down. In Britain, it's more or less stagnant. Something's going on in society, in other words, that causes dissatisfaction. Now, people might have been foolish in choosing Trump, but nonetheless, they weren't going to opt for the devil that they know, and they opted for Trump, as I've argued, in big numbers. Okay, objectively, the actual difference between the Trump vote and the Kamala Harris vote was marginal. What was it? 51% for Trump, 47% for Kamala Harris. That is now a bit in American terms. This was a gulf. And it didn't come down to the 6 swing states, almost without exception. Trump advanced, the Democrat vote shrunk. Lots of people stayed at home, and you can guess why in certain areas. For example, would you, if you were an Arab American, vote for Kamala Harris, whose boss has got the name quite rightly, Genocide Joe? You wouldn't vote Trump, but you're going to vote a Democrat? I can understand why people didn't vote for Kamala Harris. Anyway, I've got a list here of not scientific, it's just psephologists and pollsters who've rated, the why question. Not at the top, but near the top, we've got the economy. It was the economy stupid. 31% said that the most important issue was the economy. Next to that, and I'm grouping it not in terms of the order of numbers or percentages. I put in immigration, and 11% put that at the top of their list. And myself, and I think this is where I would criticize Michael Roberts' article. He basically says, look, people are silly. If you look at this inward migration into the United States, it actually adds to economic growth in the United States. It adds to GDP, and there's no doubt about that. That's true with a lot of advanced capitalist countries, Britain, France, Germany, not least the United States. But what he forgets is the experience on the ground. For example, if you're on a building site, what happens to your wages when you get an unregistered Mexican coming to the boss and say, I'll work for less than that guy? That's what goes on. And so people do face competition from migrant labor, illegal migrant labor. After all, one of the basic tenets of Marxism is that the working class needs to organize in order to limit competition. So I would actually put into this question of the economy stupid, I'd actually include migration as well. You could argue, and I've got no reason to dispute your argument, if you said that people are just prejudiced, they can't stand foreigners. But isn't almost anyone in America a foreigner? No, I would actually argue that this is also about economics. It's about competition. It's about competition not only for jobs, but competition in terms of services and schools and other such questions. So what we have in the United States is a majority of people on wages under $50,000 voting for Trump. Usually that block of the electorate actually vote Democrat. There is a misconception on the left that it's poor people who would vote for a candidate like Trump. Well, it's true this time, but normally, under normal circumstances, that section of the population, the bottom end of the working class, tends to vote Democrat. Anyway, the state of democracy was the highest on the list. 35% said it was that. Now, I know you can get that with the Trumpites when they look at the stolen election, certainly when they look at the lawfare that the Democrats have been conducting against Trump ever since he got into office. That might cover it. But I would argue, in the midst of Trump being called a fascist, not only by Kamala Harris, but by the Democrats across the board, by the media, by ex and serving military officers, I would actually suggest that the majority of them, I'm not a scientific guess, but I would guess a majority of them would be Kamala Harris voters. Abortion, 14%. Again, something that was big on Kamala Harris. I don't think that was a motivating factor to get people to vote Trump. I think I'm safe on that one. He sidelined the issue somewhat by going, it's about state rights. I'm not going to restore Roe versus Wade, but it's up to you. It's up to the states. That's his message. But nonetheless, that featured big in terms of Kamala Harris's campaign. What sort of results are there going to be as a result of the Trump presidency? Well, not saying top of my list, but nonetheless, I think significantly moves to make public employees more easily sackable. And what we're talking about here is the Department of Defense. We're talking across the board in terms of government. We're talking about, in other words, Trump, I would guess, purging what we would call the civil service of Democrats and dangerous lefties, Marxists. And I'd also suggest that could easily apply to quite a lot of serving generals as well. He also promises, and this is related, to finish building the wall, but more significantly, I think, to actually deploy the army, not the National Guard, but the army to the southern border. And clearly, we've known this with Trump's first term. There's an agenda with Trump to involve the army in domestic politics, to use it as an instrument of domestic politics. And we also have the Army High Command and the outgoing, will be soon, outgoing Defense Secretary saying, remember, and this is a message that's been sent to all serving personnel, your loyalty primarily is to the US Constitution, not the commander-in-chief. That's a significant message. And basically what it says is, look, if he issues orders that appear to be unconstitutional, you are obliged to disobey those orders. Now, make of that what you will. I think that is significant. That doesn't mean, I think, that the US is on the verge of civil war or anything like that, but, keep an eye on what's going on. I think we can safely say that people from Muslim countries, people from a Muslim background, will find it very difficult to get in to the United States once Trump has his hand on the inauguration Bible. I can see him doing that as one of the first, presidential acts. I think we can be pretty safe that Trump will introduce measures to cut taxes. This will benefit his rich friends. I don't see it making any substantial difference, any real difference when it comes to ordinary people. Indeed, I read one article. I mean, who knows? He's promising, for example, not to tax tips. You might go, okay, well, that's really great for people who work in, restaurants and in bars. But there's also the idea that some hedge fund managers will make their bonuses into tips, which is a remarkable thought that your company pays you $1 million in terms of a tip. So we're potentially talking about a very lucrative loophole for the very rich. So we're not talking about a few dollars potentially, or even a few $100 potentially for the very rich. This could be a gold mine, but they're going to get richer and richer. Also, when it comes to so-called civil rights, I think we can see a rollback. And we're told, and I think we should believe it, that when it comes to lesbian, gays, when it comes to diversity, when it comes to positive discrimination, all of that's going to go in terms of no federal funding. And indeed, we're also promised, and I think it will be delivered, that critical race theory will be outlawed. And we also have, how they enforce it, I don't know, but I think they will in one way or another. Trump promises to purge the Marxists from higher education. Well, I've already mentioned one, August Nemts. I mean, all I need to do is look, behind me at the books on my bookshelf, and a good percentage of them are written by Americans who work in academia, who work in higher education, or at least have worked. Is their employment just about to come to an end? Quite possibly. We'll see a purge of academia, that people who've got association with Palestinian solidarity. I don't know what criteria. Maybe they accuse them of being racists. Maybe they just accuse them of being Marxists. I don't know. But there will be, I think, a purge of higher education. Okay. There's also the threat, again, you need to take it seriously, and that is the threat to deport 13 million illegal migrants, people who haven't entered the country legally, who are scratching out a living in the grey and the black economy. Of course, they're not going to deport 13 million people. It's too disruptive. But what you do is you make them even more illegal. What you make them is even more desperate in terms of competition with other workers. The boss, after all, can turn around to illegal workers and say, well, if you want a pay rise, I can deport you. I can just call the police and you'll be out of the country. So you accept not an increase in your pay from me, I demand a pay decrease. And that's what I'm going to do. And you can imagine under those circumstances, antagonism towards illegal workers actually increasing, becoming more and more intense. And again, the irony is here that what we have is a lot of Latino workers, and particularly men, as I understand it, this time voted Trump. They identify with Trump in terms of his social conservatism, but they will also too be victims of this, because they tend to be at the bottom end of the working class. And clearly the majority of illegal migrants come from the south, from Mexico and further south, countries such as Colombia, Venezuela, and all the rest of it. Okay, foreign policy. At the top of Trump's list is tariffs. He says that this is the most beautiful word in the English language, and he promises to introduce tariffs ranging at the bottom end of 10%, at the top end 60%. I think this will primarily, although not exclusively, be aimed at China. That's what he says, and I think we should believe him. If you look at the news, it's interesting. I was just reading, for some bizarre reason, an Italian site that was commenting on what's going on in the United States. And they said, well, China's going to be safe. It's got a massive trade surplus. Indeed, its trade surplus this year is expected, this 2024, is expected to be $1 trillion. And that's about, tell it's an Italian site, that's about the size of Italy's gross national product. But the fact of the matter is, I think, that if Trump does put, really steep tariffs on Chinese goods, I think it will not only produce a lowering of Chinese growth rates, and that's the expectation in terms of economists at the moment. They're talking about China growing this year by 4.8%. That's not quite their 5% target, but nonetheless. But they're talking about 2025, it going down to 4.5. But there's the potential of actually forcing China into something not dissimilar to what they call, isn't it, the lost decade, or is it the lost decades in terms of Japan? Remember, well, at least I do. I'm getting old, aren't I? But if you look back at the 60s, 70s, 80s, Japan had a massive growth rate. It was exporting cars, motorbikes, you name it. And there was talk of, Japan becoming the #1 capitalist power. It was never going to happen. Either way, the United States basically imposed on Japan a situation of where it stopped growing. And it didn't just stop growing for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but for a decade, and followed by another decade, followed by another decade. Now, that can happen to China because what we're talking about is its biggest market, that's the United States, becoming too expensive when it comes to its electric vehicles, becoming too expensive when it comes to a whole host of different commodities. And of course, what that will mean in terms of the United States itself, and no one knows, but most economists are saying it, that means inflation. And that means, in terms of manufacturers in the United States, but also people who are consumers, the price of their mouse goes up, the price of their computer goes up, the price of their microphone goes up, the price of your shoes goes up, the price of almost everything goes up, because so much of it now is made in China. Now, do we expect the United States to reindustrialize on that basis? Well, there might be some, but I don't myself expect there to be a shift, a reshoring back to the United States. My understanding is, for example, that as the United States has sanctioned, for example, China, or put tariffs on against China, manufacturers look to other countries. So, for example, one comes to mind is Vietnam. So if in Vietnam they just put 10% tariffs on, you'll get a lot of American and transnational companies transferring from China, not back to the United States, but to other such countries that can control their labor force in the same way that China can. Okay. What is true for China will also be true for Europe. There is the suggestion, I think it's rather risible myself, that Britain will be spared these tariffs. Why? Because of Brexit. I would just go, are you dumb? yes, Britain is no longer in the EU, but who is the man you most associate with trying to keep Britain in the EU? I can't think of anyone, other than Keir Starmer, who really stymied every effort that was made by Theresa May to come in with some soft Brexit deal. Either way, I would actually suggest that Trump's America has got no reason to give Sir Keir Starmer's Britain an easy ride. Indeed, just looking at British politics at the moment, I don't think it's fantasy politics to suggest that Kemi Badenoch will be the next prime minister after Keir Starmer, in spite of Labour's huge parliamentary majority. And if Britain does get a good deal, I think it will owe more to Nigel Farage than it will Sir Keir Starmer. Anyway, we wait and see. Okay, the Middle East. I think leave aside this weird story about an Iranian plot to assassinate Donald Trump. I don't know how real that is, but the significance isn't that there was a plot. The significance is that the plot has been revealed. It's been made public. And under conditions where Israel, for example, retaliated, I'm using that in inverted commas, retaliated against Iran in a very restrained way, as it did last time, clearly held back by the Biden administration. Blinken, was doing super diplomacy to hold Israel back. What was Trump's reaction to that? He said, well, you should have done the job. You should have gone for the nuclear sites. And my fear is that precisely, even before Trump gets into the White House, Netanyahu, now with his new defense secretary, defense minister, could quite conceivably do just that. Biden is now sitting, useless. No one's going to take any notice of Biden. Biden can turn around and say, well, I'll cut off spare parts to F-35s. I won't supply you with, maintenance for Patriot missiles. Netanyahu will put two fingers up because he knows, he's certain that come January the 20th, Trump will restore everything that's been cut and more, some too. So there's a great danger when it comes to Israel and Iran. And I'd also say that there is a great danger now when it comes to the Palestinians, both in Gaza, but also the West Bank. There's legislation in Israel allowing them to annex more blocks of the West Bank. And that was something that was approved of when Trump was president. It hasn't been something that's been acted upon in Israel, not least because Biden isn't keen on it. But under Trump, what's going to happen in Gaza? I don't know, but I think when he says finish the job, he clearly isn't talking about destroying Hamas. He clearly isn't talking about getting the hostages back. That's not what this war is about. I can't see any logic in this war on that basis. You don't bomb the shit out of a place if you want to save your hostages. If that's your priority, what you do is negotiate, and you don't kill your negotiating partners. I mean, there's Israel not only going after the leadership, but trying to destroy Hamas as an organization. I don't think that's really the aim. I think the aim is a second Nakba. And I think that Trump will allow Netanyahu to go for it. And I fear that given that Egypt is a massive recipient of US aid, I think it's the second in the world next to Israel, but it's a weak government. I don't know whether it would accept 2 million Gazans being pushed over the border? I don't know, but that's what I fear. And I fear the same, actually, when it comes to the West Bank. Now, whether that will be one operation or compartmentalized, I haven't got a clue. But clearly, that is the aim of the Netanyahu coalition government. It is the aim of Zionism. The real question is what political risk that entails. Who knows what the hell would happen in terms of the regime in Cairo, Amman, Riyadh. I haven't got a clue myself. All you can say is that Trump coming in will change everything, and it will have unintended consequences for the United States and for the entire region. Trump will certainly not bring peace. In the Middle East, he will bring dispossession and perhaps regime collapses. So, okay, let's move on. Having mentioned the P word, peace, no surprise when it comes to Ukraine. What we have is what has been trailed. You know, J.D. Vance has talked about it. It's the Kellogg fights plan. And this is the idea of freezing the 1,000-kilometer long front line. What you then do is establish a buffer zone. I don't know what side of the front line that would be. Either way, you establish a buffer zone, and what the plan is that this will be patrolled by European powers, potentially including Britain. By the way, they pay for it. America is not going to pay a penny for this. After the buffer zone has been established, then you get into negotiations. And what's the message to Vladimir Zelensky? You've lost Crimea. You're not going to get Crimea back. We are not going to finance your war to take back every inch of post 1991 Ukrainian territory. And indeed, what is being spoken about is potentially doing a deal on the Donbass, perhaps incorporating the Donbass in as an autonomous zone in Ukraine, but it takes two to negotiate. Would Putin go for that? Or would he insist on, well, we've annexed not only Crimea, but we've annexed 4 other oblasts, and we at least want a slice of them? I don't know. What I do know, or at least what I suspect, is in spite of his bravado, and I think that's all it is, Zelensky, at the end of the day, will have no choice in the matter. There is the suggestion, I've heard it, I think it's risible, that the European powers will step in. I was doing a little bit of research last night, and in terms of the amount of military aid that's been delivered to Ukraine since 2022, since February 2022, the United States has delivered twice as much as the European powers, the bigger European powers, and I'm including, by the way, in that the Netherlands, Denmark, Poland. It's delivered twice as much as all of those countries put together. That shows you who's really financing this war. Europe is playing a role, but really it's been the United States. That's what's been going on. And if, for example, Trump turned around to Zelensky and says, I simply switch the tap off, what happens then to the Ukrainian army? What happens to its F-16s? What happens to its logistics? What happens if Elon Musk, who was standing there next to Trump when he had his meeting with Zelensky, says, I'm turning off, what was it, Starlink, is it? Anyway, you know the one I'm talking about. I turn off the satellite communications that you've been using. Certainly the United States could deny Ukraine military messages from its satellites that it's been using for example, to attack targets in Crimea, or ships in the Black Sea, or command posts behind the front line. All of that is electronic warfare enabled by the United States. Well, what the United States delivers, the United States can turn off. And I'll just give you this, that in terms of modern aircraft, for every hour that they fly, and it does vary from one to the other, but something like 10 hours of maintenance is required. And that means spare parts. That doesn't just mean tightening the nuts and the bolts. It means parts have to be manufactured and refitted, refitted, refitted constantly. The United States could switch that off. And the idea of Europe coming in to substitute for the United States, is Trump going to take kindly to that? Is he really going to say, oh yeah, carry on Britain. You carry on financing a war when I want peace negotiations. Carry on Germany. Carry on supplying tanks. You carry on. He's not going to allow it. It's simply not going to happen. If the United States wants to have peace negotiations, it can get it from the European side, and I think it can get it from a Ukrainian side. Now, that might cost Zelensky the presidency. I could imagine, and again, I haven't got any evidence for this, it's just, hey, these things happen. I can imagine something like, for example, the Azov Brigade mutinying, but successfully, getting rid of Zelensky, accusing Zelensky of being a traitor. Not a real Ukrainian, they would say. They'd say he's Jewish, he's not really a patriot. These are Banderites. These people, come from what you can genuinely call a fascist, ideological, but also political background. But then what could they do? Could they fight this war? Would Europe back such a regime in Kiev? I'm skeptical, to say the least. Either way, of course, it still takes two to negotiate. So what will Putin do under these circumstances? My reading of it so far, for what it's worth, is that he's played it very cool. He hasn't thrown his arms up in the air and said, victory for the Kremlin, a victory for Mother Russia. He's been deliberately restrained. I was reading, I can't remember her name, is it? Anyway, it's Khrushchev's, Nikita Khrushchev's great granddaughter. She's now an American academic. And she's saying that, with Trump, Putin thinks that he can afford to take his time. He thinks he's going to get some big concessions here. Now, I don't know, but I suspect that she's right. After all, if we think about it, what was the US war aim when it came to Ukraine? Well, one, deny Russia access to the Black Sea. Two, deny Russia access to the Mediterranean through the Black Sea. Secondly, break up the Russian Federation. Use that breakup of the Russian Federation to surround and strangle China. All of that is now up in the air. I think the aim of China is still there, but there is the possibility of turning Russia in the same way that Nixon, for example, turned China, with the ping pong diplomacy and the visit to Beijing, that Beijing went from a country that had antagonism to the old Soviet Union, really to an ally when it came to international politics, to the United States. It's not impossible to imagine the FSB Putin regime in Moscow going with such a deal. Now, that's big speculation, I readily admit, but you have to ask, what is Trump after? And he's not just after ending a war in Europe. That doesn't really matter as far as he's concerned. The aim of the Democrats and the aim of the Republicans always has been China. And you can skin a cat in two different ways. And that might completely fail. And what Trump says, and it's not a small if Trump doesn't get his way with Putin. If Putin doesn't agree a deal that's satisfactory to the United States, then he will go in with the war big time. And what he's saying is that he would prosecute the war in a more aggressive way than the Biden administration has done. And my guess is that here we're talking about the potential of Trump to adopt what is called Zelensky's victory plan. At the top of that is the use of Storm Shadow and other such missiles on the territory of the Russian Federation, not the annexed bits of it, but the Russian Federation of post 1991, which Putin has said, if you do that, if you use these missiles because they require American technology to target them, NATO and Russia are at war. And there's been talk in that context of using nuclear weapons. Well, take that seriously. And also, I've got no clue. If someone has got a clue, please pipe up. There are 3 secret clauses in Zelensky's victory plan. Maybe they are things like using the territory of NATO to shoot down Russian drones. Maybe it's got provisions about providing a nuclear umbrella for either the whole of Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. I simply haven't got a clue. What I do know is that Trump not only comes bearing the olive branch, but also behind, he's got a big stick. And he's promising that you ain't seen nothing yet. So I'm taking that as precisely Zelensky's victory plan, and that is very dangerous. That is a real threat of the world, using Trump's words, of phasing into World War III. It doesn't mean it'll just break out, but sleepwalking into World War III. Climate, well, God help us. Here we are. I think that 2024, according to all the forecasts, is going to be the year of where we go over 1.5, and we're going towards a situation of where 1.5 plus becomes the new norm. And we could go into, well, look at the storms, you know, in America, one after the other, you know, back to back hurricanes. We can talk about Spain and flooding, but we can certainly talk about the climate crisis. And what's Trump proposing to do? My guess is once again to pull out of the Paris Accords. And what's he say domestically? Drill, baby, drill. He will remove restrictions on, national parks. He will remove restrictions on cars. So California can't have its special regulations, which, given the size of California, basically means California decides what American standards are. All of that's going to go. That's what we are told, which is extremely bad news for a planet that is already walking into a situation of where it continues to produce more and more CO2 every year. So what do we expect? Trump won't be around. I won't be around. But we would expect, because you can't turn these things around fast, vast areas to be flooded. I don't know how much of the Netherlands would survive, but the expectation is whole cities like Alexandria, Jakarta, Dhaka, parts of London, Houston, one can carry on down the list, Shanghai, all of these cities will be inundated. And one can imagine, again, it having disastrous consequences in terms of existing agriculture. Who knows about the US wheat belt, for example? You can certainly say in certain parts of the world it becomes impossible, to work for ordinary people. They would simply suffer from heat stroke and all the rest. That's the world that we're going towards. And here you have the world hegemon trying actually to speed up that scenario. It's a frightening prospect. But that seems what the course that Trump is taking. Okay, lastly, what's the time, Billy? 52. Just finish on this. There's clearly going to be an election in Germany sooner rather than later. The two leading parties are the CDU, Christian Democrat, and Social, the Bavarian allies in that bloc. My latest opinion polls, 32%, followed by the AfD. Now, at the moment, all parties are saying we ain't going to touch the AfD with a barge pole. My expectation is, not with this election, but who the hell knows, we should expect Germany to move sharply to the right. And all I'd say is, in terms of any prospect of an independent Europe under capitalism, basically relies on Germany. And all I was going to say is that if you take the AfD at the moment, for example, it's against the Ukraine war. I could imagine the CDU coming out with the same position, but I could also imagine it flipping into the opposite position. My basic argument in this political report is that we are now entering an extremely unstable and dangerous world. And existing alliances, existing certainties are crumbling before our eyes. You could have a split between Europe and the United States. You could have a rapprochement between the United States and Russia. You could conceive of a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, but at the same time, you could conceive of Israel being given the go-ahead to attack their nuclear facilities. Everything is up in the air. And the precise problem is, where's the left? That's the problem that we've got. We have got to go beyond, as August Nimmt says in this week's Socialist Worker, we've got to go beyond the politics of choosing the lesser of two evils. And in Britain, of course, that means Labour and the Tories. In America, the Democrats and Republicans. In Germany, CD, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. We have got to stop tailing. We've got to stop choosing the lesser of two evils. There's no right time to take, an independent stance, but it needs to be done. And I'm going to finish with that. Thank you, Billy.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack.